HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard, by John Birdsall. Read by Daniel Henning. Preface. In the beginning, there was James Beard. Before Julia, before barbecuing daddies, before a wine closet in the life of every grape nut and the glorious coming of age of American wines, before the new American cooking, chefs as superstars, and our great irrepressible gourmania, there was James Beard, our big daddy. Gail Green. If you live in the United States and believe in local food, rely on farmers' markets and produce stands to supply flavor and seasonal delight to your cooking. If you take for granted access to milk, butter, and cheese produced in human-scale lots, bakers who employ patience and their hands, and American wines expressive of soil and tradition, you owe a debt to James Beard. Born in Portland, Oregon in 1903, Beard came of age when the industrialization of American food was well underway. Starting in about 1940, Beard, in cookbooks and magazine articles and live cooking demonstrations, preached resistance to the dumbing down of food by commercial interests. At a time when the food press was largely a PR wing of manufacturers aligned to profit, Beard argued for taste. Throughout most of the 20th century, Americans believed that fine food was synonymous with delicacies imported mostly from France, canned truffles, foie gras, and pâté, wines often cooked en route that had endured Atlantic crossings without refrigeration. The nascent American gourmet food movement of the 1930s and 1940s was enthralled with imports. In the 1950s and 1960s, however, Beard gained an appreciation for the beauty and vividness of American foods, of smokehouse hams from Kentucky, wines from California, cheeses inoculated with mold and left to ripen in Iowa caves, and fruits and vegetables grown with an appreciation of the soil of the region by farmers and orchardists who valued flavor more than expediency. In 1949, he urged city dwellers to grow baby corn on their fire escapes so they'd know the pleasure of freshly picked ears. A decade later, he tried to convince New Yorkers it was worth sourcing eggs from farmers who raised chickens free to roam small-scale poultry yards on the fringes of the metropolis's sprawl. Starting in the late 1970s, Beard became a mentor to a new generation of chefs, yearning to cook in regional idioms with ingredients culled from the landscapes where they felt themselves rooted. Beard was an inspiration to chefs in the 1980s, cooking under the banner of New American. Larry Forgione, Alice Waters, Jeremiah Tower, and Bradley Ogden all looked to Beard as someone who remembered what food tasted like before the supermarkets killed off local butchers and produce stands. He was also a national character, instantly recognizable to most Americans from the 1950s until his death in 1985. At 6'3" and hovering around 300 pounds, James had an enormous physical presence. He was usually genial in public, prone to cornball puns and a folksy delivery that tended to make his audiences lose their anxiety about making a proper soufflé or buying a bottle of wine. Beard made it look fun. He embodied America's culinary identity for most of the second half of the 20th century. James Beard was American food, its pleasures and excesses, its beauty and simplicity. He was one of the most famous people in America, and he was terrified that the public would find out who he really was. To the small circle of New York's food world, the fact that James Beard was gay was an open secret. To most everyone else in America in the 1950s and 1960s, the people who bought his cookbooks and read his articles and showed up to his cooking classes, his queerness would have been problematic, to say the least. No ecstatic gospel of taste, no wisdom or charisma would have made the man most Americans had invited into their kitchens, even into their national identities, the man who embodied pleasure in food in a uniquely American way, anything but a pariah. In 2013, I pitched an essay to the quarterly magazine Lucky Peach for its gender issue about the closeted male food writers who defined American cooking in the 20th century. My stimulus was rage. Lucky Peach was a representation of America's chef culture, a space where queerness was allowed to flicker only at the margins. A code of straightness ruled the nation's restaurant kitchens, an ethos oozing corrosive gender tropes. If you were queer in the kitchen, chances were you didn't dare let your guard slip all the way down. An injustice still aching within me, a gay veteran of those battle zones, years after I'd left cooking to become a writer. Lucky Peach had built an arena for chefs, yet queer voices didn't rise there. The silence flooded me with grievance, especially since every chef I knew wanted to win a James Beard award. Didn't they realize Beard was gay? Couldn't they see the irony of thirsting after a medal molded with his image, these chefs for whom homophobia was a scar on the face of kitchen culture? And so I pitched my story to Lucky Peach. Chris Ying, an editor, emailed to say he'd take it. I wrote furiously on a short deadline. I called it, "America, Your Food is So Gay." While it's common knowledge today that Claiborne, Olney, and Beard were gay, the details of their queer lives, the complexity of experience in the lives of these architects of American food, are still misunderstood. In my Lucky Peach essay, I talked about my own experience growing up in a world of gay men living in and out of the closet, having a coded existence around food. My gay uncles, Pat Matera and Lou Barker, who helped raise me in my conservative California suburb where they lived quietly. Men for whom food was a language that defied the ordinary coding of the closet, and who used food as public expression, a matrix of color, feeling, and pleasure, the exuberance of intimate lives they couldn't otherwise reveal to the world. And even after my essay appeared in print, even after I won a James Beard Award for it in New York the following year, draped with a medal bearing his image, Beard continued to be the member of my trio who haunted me. I kept thinking about the complicated ways Beard lived a gay life, closeted and afraid. Like most of his gay contemporaries in the decades after World War II, a period of brutal oppression for queer Americans. How did Beard, at precisely the same time, become the joyful face of American food? It was a question I felt a responsibility to answer, because most of the detail of Beard's life as a gay man had been suppressed, compromised, or erased. I felt I had to give it voice. To trace over the things that Beard himself, with the help of friends and enablers, tried to wipe from the official record of his life. Two earlier biographies, Epicurean Delight, 1990, by Evan Jones, and James Beard, A Biography, 1994, retitled The Solace of Food, by Robert Clark, did an impressive job of tracing the events of Beard's rise in American food, and, in the case of Clark's, of understanding his complicated persona. And even though Clark surfaced many details of Beard's private gay life, I felt that a deeper understanding of queerness in his biography would illuminate so much of his extraordinary career, and, by extension, the history of American food in the 20th century. Queerness wasn't just an interesting footnote to Beard's life. Queerness was its central principle, the fact around which Beard organized his existence. His entire life was gay. Carl Jerome, Beard's assistant from 1972 to 1976, told me. It was governed by his sexuality. And yet, said Marion Cunningham, Beard's teaching assistant and close friend, it was a part of Beard's life he chose to keep very quiet. This was the central paradox of Beard's life: to be a beloved national figure, someone every American cook invited into their kitchen and felt a certain intimacy with, and yet hide who he was. At a time when kitchen Bibles, encyclopedic recipe collections, such as The Joy of Cooking, were dominant, Beard longed to write in a personal narrative style. He looked to Alice B. Toklas as a hero for the way she blended recipes and memoir in the Alice B. Toklas Cookbook of 1954. Yet Alice was a legend and an eccentric. Her well-known lesbianism seemed to many an enduring literary quirk. With Beard, a man in the prime of life in 1954, any hint of his sexuality had to be denied. Any memoir of Beard's would have to be semi-mythical, to fill in the parts he couldn't tell. Queerness and food were indistinguishable in Beard's life. As a young man at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, Beard experienced trauma through his sexual life, an incident that dictated the way he expressed his queerness for the next 60-plus years, until his death in 1985. Those were amazing decades in LGBTQ history. They included the loosening of gender roles during World War II, the persecution of homosexuals during the McCarthy Purge and the Cold War, the nascent queer civil rights movements of the 1950s, followed by Stonewall, the sexual revolution, gay liberation, the rise and assassination of Harvey Milk, and the first years of the AIDS pandemic. Through it all, Beard remained officially closeted, minding his Reed scar, cautious and afraid. From the outside, Beard's life looked rich and happy. Secretly, he suffered from loneliness and depression, struggled constantly with doubts about his work and constant worries about money. Depression plagued him all his life. Travel usually made him happy and more relaxed, more himself. In the 15 years following the end of World War II, France and Spain, in particular, offered relative freedom for queer travelers. Living in virtual exile during that time exposed Beard to recipes and eating traditions that contributed to his ethos of American food. And his experience of being in exile at home caused him to turn away from much of mainstream society, especially the dominant culture of magazine editors and cookbook publishing. At a time of strict gender roles, he was a man in a woman's profession. His size and other physical realities made him feel ugly and unlovable. He expressed the deepest part of himself in silence. Beard knew rejection from an early age, and it made him embrace food and fame in a unique way. Though he was always present in American kitchens, Beard carried himself like an outsider, an alien with a secret, a man on a lonely coast who told us we could find meaning and comfort by embracing pleasure. For a biographer, Beard is a challenging figure. He concealed so much of his private life from view, destroying letters he thought were too revealing, incriminating, or embarrassing. Instead, he turned his public history into myth, and he did it with such force of conviction that it's tempting to take all of it as true. Brooklyn artist and social activist Avram Finkelstein asserts that to be queer is to be an archaeologist. To find traces of ourselves in a world that prefers us hidden, he writes, we excavate. This biography excavates the story of Beard that he and those close to him tried to destroy. Where documents don't exist, I studied old photographs and contemporary records to animate Beard's life. I kept returning to a quote by Jean-Yves Tadier from the introduction to his biography of Marcel Proust. Even if we knew all the facts about a subject's life, Tadier writes, and had heard all the testimonies, we would still have to interpret them. It is here that a biographer's task resembles that of the novelist, because it is a matter of delving beneath appearances, of providing sense and meaning. Today, we often seek a human connection through cooking. Look on recipes and cookbooks as a window into other lives and experiences. Ironically, given that he had to hide so much of his authentic self, Beard was a pioneer in using food to communicate a lifestyle. He made food central to American identity. This is the story of the architect of that identity, a man most of us know as an institution, fixed on a medal, like a soul trapped in a mirror, restless to be freed. Part 1. Chapter 1. The Swaddled Ham. 1913. With a fidgety mind, the boy silently reeled off names of the stops in front of them, depots strung along the rails running south from where the river started. Warrenton, Columbia Beach, Carnahan, West Gearhart, Surf, Seaside. The 10-year-old knew the list by heart. Half a dozen stations along the 15-mile Clatsop Beach line on the Astoria and Columbia River Railroad, last leg of the 5-hour journey from Portland. The boy and his mother would get off at West Gearhart, which everybody called Gearhart Park. Ticket men and porters, and the women shouting above the rumble and roar of the day coaches, acquaintances of his mother's who'd likewise started out on the number 29, the early beach train from town. With each stop, James's picture of their house on Salmon Street would grow blurrier, its sadness and sharp edges dissolving under the promise of summer and release. With each slowing, each lurch to a halt in a new station, another piece of him would jostle free. This was James' escape, a journey he and Elizabeth took 3 times a year. In the weeks till August gave out, he would try to evade her jurisdiction. Not difficult, since she would have 100 daily preoccupations as usual. For the next 3 months, James would keep as much as he could to the shelter of knolls and dune hollows, of old pathways and unfathomable forests at the top of Tillamook Head, and to the cold embrace of the ocean. Even now he was a strong swimmer, paddling far out, deaf to cries from shore. For the next 3 months, his favorite taste would be of oysters, hauled down from shoals above the terrifyingly wide mouth of the Columbia and fried in an abundance of butter. He knew the sound they'd make, hissing and foaming, edging into brownness, with a scent so rich it would seem capable of tinting the air gold. James's father rarely joined them at the beach. John Beard almost always stayed behind on Salmon Street with James's older half-sister Lucille, a schoolteacher, and her husband Clarence. John seemed a man invariably absorbed in his work as chief examiner of goods from China and Japan, squinting over wrenched open crates of import merchandise at the U.S. Custom House in Portland. With James and Elizabeth gone, John would have unchallenged dominion over the dark rooms on Salmon Street. The boy knew that in place of the taut silence that reigned when the family was together, the house would soften under the influence of John's odious smells. Balsam hair oil, cigarettes, boiled pork side meat. Yet the trying things about home would recede further and further from James's thought as the train headed toward the coast. From his stool on the deck of the observation car, 2 coaches behind Elizabeth, who rode on green plush, James watched dull black coal smoke erupt from the locomotive and fog the cars behind. It curled around the edges of the train and faded like the after flourish in a magician's vanishing trick. At Columbia Beach, James watched the train disgorge flushed women lugging valises and children reeking of sour sweat and drooled stick candy, a rabble as eager as he was for summer to start. Porters hauled off steamer trunks and sacks of letters that had packed the car's vestibules since the train crossed the long, rickety, scaled rail bridge at Astoria. Mothers yelled to their broods to step lively crossing the tracks before scrabbling off to the shade of scalloped overhangs, slumping from depots not much grander than sheds, set on one long, south-yawning plain, damp with the breath of ocean. They were so unlike James and his mother, these frazzled women and their horrible offspring. James was a precocious boy, raised to air his opinions no matter how disagreeably. Elizabeth had seen to that. Even at this age, he found opera divine. Elizabeth took him to hear Madama Butterfly when he was 5, and the beauty of it made him weep. His ardor ripened in the parlor recitals he and his mother attended in the houses and boarding hotel rooms of friends his father avoided, actresses who laced their tea with brandy, men who winked at James and gave him sticky homemade marshmallows or nougat. Today, the wail of cast-iron wheels at each curve along the rails sang in his ears like the cry of Violetta in La Traviata. "Astrano, astrano." How strange. While the cry of the steam whistle sounded back, "A diletti sempre nuovo," always new to delight. They'd started from home that morning just after 7, in a hired cart with their hoard of trunks, hand luggage, and hat boxes, a summer's worth of library books, stacked and tied with sash cord, and a large, unwieldy, and thick-reeded picnic hamper. Elizabeth had swaddled the cooked ham like an enormous baby, first in waxed paper, then canvas, but James could smell it leaking through the wicker. Cedar smoke fused with the mustard and molasses sugar of the glaze, acrid and sweet. James had barely finished his breakfast tea and coddled egg and toast fingers. The aroma of ham left him hungry again. They jolted westward across Portland's shiny, still-new Hawthorne Bridge, above a Willamette riverfront clotted with double-decked ferries and billboards vaunting sacks of high-flight flour, bottles of Coca-Cola, and preferred stock in cans. The fascinating things James' mother thought too vapid or vulgar to allow through the screened back porch to her kitchen. At 47, Elizabeth had a plush figure and a biscuit dough complexion. Her forehead was broad, above a powerful nose, and eyebrows so fine and pale they looked transparent. They gave her a blank expression, guarded, scoured of passion, except that the combination of a taut mouth below cautious, heavily lidded eyes made her appear perpetually skeptical. Though she had lived in Portland for 30 years, her English accent persisted, the skimmed consonants of the impatient Londoner extracted from a gentle Wiltshire burr. This morning she wore a hat trimmed with small crepe roses and a brim that cantilevered out to her shoulders. A long-skirted traveling suit fell from her hips and flared under a knee-length summer coat in sandy linen, already creasing at the elbows. She was a barricade of fabric and flesh. James was encased in the blue serge suit with long pants he'd begged Elizabeth to buy. She'd balked at the $25 it cost, but when she learned John also disapproved, she bought it, if only to needle her husband and prove her independence. On James, the jacket bulged around the seams of its sewn-in belt, refusing to cinch like the ones in the morning Oregonian ads. James's eyes were guarded and delicate, sunk in a face as plump and pale as milk-poached meringue. Under the flat cap he wore tipped back, James had groomed his thick brown hair to lie flat against his forehead, a look more awkward and innocent than the glinting combacks on the boys who posed in smudged newspaper ink. At 8:15, their train, the northwest-bound number 29 to Astoria, juddered out of Portland's red-brick North Bank Station, the passenger terminal for the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway. It rocked along at 20 miles an hour on steel rails, quivering in bright cloud-filtered light, tracing the south bank of the Columbia River. In the southeasterly distance, the solitary twisted fang of Mount Hood dissolved in haze. Soon even Portland, the frieze-topped hotels downtown and houses poking corbelled mansards through the trees of the western hills, petered out. First myrtles and spruce, then forests swallowed the riverbank's roads and rail yards, its ice houses, and eventually its salmon canneries, before which Chinese workers paused on planks strung across rough piers to watch the train lurch by in a burgeoning black chrysanthemum of coal smoke. James's eyes settled on one man, smoking as he loitered outside a salmon shack perched on stilts in the wide river. Wearing boots and a long rubber apron slicked with scales and guts, he raised his hand to wave at the boy in the blue suit, seated on a camp stool on the awning-sheltered platform behind the observation parlor car, the train's last. James waved back, and for a second thought it was Juliette, the Beard's family cook, recently departed, whose tea cakes and curries, Welsh rabbits and roast ducks were even now the vivid memory pictures in a fairy story of life on Salmon Street that existed far from reality. But the man with the cigarette, disappearing now as the train banked along a bend in the tracks, was a stranger, whose wave was nothing more than a curious, ultimately disinterested hello. From the observation deck, James followed the rise and fall of scenery beyond the spill of the city. He knew it all, every mile, just as he knew the hinged tableaus in a well-loved pop-up picture book, the river's curves, scribed along the south bank in sagging telegraph wires strung from stripped pines, the fenced pastures and farmhouses with here and there a huffing smokehouse, the slovenly shacks and prim white rural Gothic churches. Their pointy, narrow windows looked to James, if he squinted, like ears of corn in the husk. First stop was St. Helens, a town at the northern tip of Sauvie Island, where Multnomah Channel cleaved apart from the Columbia. James could just make out the Arctic dome of Washington's famous dormant volcano, in the boy's imagination a hibernating mastodon the world had left to sleep. Next was Rainier, a lumber boom town strung up on forested hills. Below the railway lay the riverbank, frenzied with lumber mills churning smokestacks and new boards stacked high into megaliths, pale as tender flesh in the intensifying daylight. For 100 years, Portlanders' faith in the ability to grow their city had been as infinite as the surrounding trees, and the building frenzy of the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition had hoisted optimism and an appetite for virgin forest all the way to the ridgetops. Like James, Elizabeth relished their spring migration from Portland. Travel made her independent again, a woman of her own affairs, as she once had been. A person of business. She had friends in Rainier, people she'd known years ago in Portland when she was unattached. A widow from her first marriage, mistress of a proper boarding house, and not just a housekeeper for Lucille, whom she always disliked, and Lucille's lunkhead husband. Elizabeth had written to her Rainier friends to say which train she'd be on. They were in the station to meet it, and in the few minutes of this loitering would gab with Elizabeth about how well she looked, how much James had grown since last year, and about the warmth of the spring so far, and the early peas they reckoned were only days from harvesting. The locomotive lurched and rolled again. Astrano, astrano. Dogs, making the summer migration to the coast with their families, yapped and nipped at children. Freed from leash holds, they nosed around the day coaches, lifting legs to doorway edges and unlucky trunks in the vestibules. Sweating porters picked around them while scuttling through to deliver wax-papered chicken sandwiches and stoneware bottles of ginger beer. This was a midweek train at the start of summer vacation, so almost all the passengers were women and kids en route to beach cottages and hotels. They'd spend the weeks till September teetering in the frigid ankle waves of the Pacific, weighed down by heavy woolen bathing suits with modesty skirts, larking about at strawberry gathering parties and ice cream socials, and above all, picnicking braced before the soft, wind-protected humps of the dunes. Adilette sempre nuovi. The Saturday morning run to the coast was dubbed the Daddy Train. Husbands and fathers like John Beard, who stayed in town to work, would ride out for weekends and make the 5-hour return on Monday mornings. James's father made the journey only once or twice all summer. He cited social obligations in town he couldn't ignore, since he owed his position at the custom house in part to being in good standing with the heirs to his political patron, the late General Owen Somers, James's godfather. Besides, the beach was Elizabeth's realm, a place to entertain her women friends without the demands of Salmon Street, and to resume her catering business, an enterprise that earned her money so she could save or spend as she liked. Elizabeth and James always rode the train apart. She in the bustling day coach filled with gossip and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?